Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun?
Who owns the patent on this vaccine?
It's for the people.
Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun?
Who owns the patent on this vaccine?
It's for the people.
Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? There is no patent. There is no patent. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun?
Who owns the patent on this vaccine?
It's for the people.
I think that is an answer to that myth.
Who owns the patent on this vaccine?
It's for the people.
I think that is an answer to that myth.
Actually, you're okay to
Could you patent the sun?
We're going to make a start, don't worry. Okay, cool. Hello, everyone. Welcome back for day 2 of our conference. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really glad to have you back for the Price of Life Day 2. In case you didn't meet us yesterday, my name is Freka. I'm joined with Aisha. We're both intercalating medics at King's, and we're also the co-chairs for this conference. We're really excited for our plans for the day. The theme, following on from yesterday's question of why our current systems need to change, is how can these systems change? And hopefully you'll see that reflected through the workshops and everything we've got planned. So to give you a brief overview of the day, I think you should be able to see the brochure in the chat if you've not already had access to it. We'll be opening with our first plenary, discussing why we need to have an international and intersectional approach to access to medicines. And our speakers are already with us for that, which is really exciting. We're then going to have 2 options for workshops. We've got either an ethical conundrum, transparency in clinical trials, or research and development the right way, led by one of our UAEMers. After our lunch break, we have another round of workshops, one on UK aid cuts and why these matter, and we need to be campaigning about that. And then also really engaging workshop on artistic activism with some artists who've been working with us for quite a while now at UAEM. Our final session of the conference will be a fantastic campaign training session, giving you the opportunity to take part in our hashtag Where's the Vaccine campaign and learn about how to lobby your MP. And if that's not enough excitement for you, we're also going to be announcing the winner of our vaccine plushie giveaway competition. So make sure you stay till the end to watch out for that. As yesterday, we have coffee break scheduled as well as our lunch break, and there's going to be breakout rooms available if you want to network or chat with any of us from the conference team. And our speakers have also agreed to join into breakout rooms following this plenary, so you'll be able to have a more informal and relaxed chat with them if you're interested.
Amazing. And we're really excited to announce that today will be the official launch of the hashtag Where's the Vaccine campaign. There are a number of ways for you to get involved. So first, you can take part in an action from Global Justice Now, calling for the suspension of patents during the pandemic, which you can find in the chat. Second, we're running a TikTok and video-based campaign where you can raise awareness of the need for equitable access. And again, more information about this can be found in the chat. Finally, we will be sharing information about vaccine equity all day on our social media, so make sure you keep up to date with us and like, share, or retweet any posts using hashtag Where's the Vaccine and of course hashtag Price of Life 2021. Just like yesterday, a little reminder from us, we have an amazing team on hand, so if you do need Zoom links or if you want to message us, here's our social medias on the screen right now and our email address just in case you get lost. This link will be open throughout the whole day, so do come back here if you're confused on what's happening and want to know what to go to next. And again, make sure you do share your experience on social media by tagging us and using hashtag Price of Life 2021.
Thanks, Aisha. Just pop in the Gmail in the chat there, so do get in touch if you have any questions. And last stream from us is just to say we hope yesterday has really laid the groundwork and got you interested in access to medicines. I think we had some great plenaries and workshops really showing why we need to engage with this issue. And hopefully today will provide you with the tools to get more involved in advocating and campaigning and seeing directly what we can do as students. So please do ask all your questions, share your opinions, make sure you get stuck in and enjoy the day. I'm now going to hand over to Maria, one of our lovely content coordinators, who's going to be chairing the third plenary of the weekend, Access an International and Intersectional Perspective.
Hi, thank you so much, Rebecca and Aisha. So, hi everyone, I'm Maria, as Rebecca said. I'm one of the content coordinators for the conference. Our first plenary of the day is, as is in the title, a discussion on access to medicines from an international and intersectional perspective. We're really lucky to be joined by speakers from across the globe today who will give a talk on this topic from their perspectives. And it'll briefly cover their experiences and their projects, after which we are hoping to have lots of questions from you to encourage a discussion. Please do send in your questions on the Zoom chat. I will try and go through them in our question time. So our first speaker is Anne Pollop, who is a professor of global health and social medicine at King's College London, whose research focuses on theories of race and gender and ways in which science and medicine are mobilized in social justice projects. We're really excited to welcome her back after her great talk at the crash course earlier this year. So without further ado, thank you so much, Anne. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much to the organizers and to all of you for being here on early on a Sunday morning. And let me just go ahead and share my slides. Can you see those okay? Great. Okay, so in my very short comments today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the need for an anti-racist decolonial frame as we demand access to medicines. And the reason for this kind of dual highlighting, I think, will become clear as we need to move beyond only a bifurcation between rich countries and poor countries, as important as that is, to also looking at important inequalities within countries, especially with regard to race, and the need to incorporate anti-racism into that decolonial frame. So obviously, we know that racism is fundamental to colonialism, and so therefore we already are in a situation in which demanding access for the two-thirds world is already an anti-racist claim. And yet I think that we need to really center anti-racism in that work for a few reasons. So in order to kind of highlight why that might be, I'll talk a little bit about some work from my books. So I'm not going to talk about my first book, although if you are interested in the importance of anti-racism in access to care, especially in the United States, I highly recommend it. It's available at the King's Library. My second book is also available from the King's Library, Synthesizing Hope, and I'll talk a bit about that. My third book is coming out this summer, and I'll talk a bit about that one as well, about anti-Black racism and health disparities in the United States, in which access to medicines is also a problem, even in the belly of the beast, right? Where pharmaceutical knowledge is, a lot of pharmaceutical knowledge is made, and which of course has been a place of hoarding of pharmaceuticals, and yet there are real barriers to access. So first, Synthesizing Hope, which I spoke to some of you about last fall, which is a book that looks at matter, knowledge, and place in South African drug discovery. It's rooted in analyzing pharmaceuticals from maybe an unexpected place, which is a place called Atemba Pharmaceuticals. So this was a drug discovery company that was founded with the mission of finding new drugs for TB, HIV, and malaria in the outskirts of Johannesburg. Now, I was brought to this particular topic actually at a conference that's not too much unlike this one where we are today. So it was a kind of an access to medicines conference, which was at Emory University. I was at the time at Georgia Tech, which is also in Atlanta, so just kind of up the street. And it was an access to medicines conference that had been organized by students in the law school. And they argued that patents were a barrier, and of course they are. But I was struck by one of the people who came to speak, who was Professor Dennis Leota. So here on the scientific board of this company, and this is how I came to find out about the company. And he said that, first a note about him. So his kind of claim to fame is that he discovered, he was part of the 3-person team that discovered second-generation antiretrovirals. So the drugs that more than 90% of people on antiretroviral therapy take across the world today, which transformed HIV from a deadly disease to one that could be managed for people who have access to the drugs. So Dennis Leota was speaking at Emory, where he is a professor, and describing this initiative because he believes that the barrier to pharmaceutical access is not just patents, and that the problem is that patents are owned by rich countries. And so therefore drug discovery kind of serves those in rich countries best and is priced out of, and the drugs produced are priced out of access to people in poorer countries. And so he kind of set about trying to transform that by developing drug discovery capacity in the global South. So specifically in South Africa. And we can talk about South Africa's kind of complicated positioning within this further. If you're interested, I'll raise just a couple of ways. But the mission of Atemba was to find inexpensive therapy for infectious diseases through innovative chemistry. And so it had a Zulu name, was going to use synthetic chemistry, and would use a staff with multinational experience, but was founded in South Africa and with the support of the South African government. And so it's really kind of speaking to both of these. So wanting to do kind of globally competitive synthetic chemistry, but in and accountable to the South African context. So I was intrigued by this, and it actually became then, this project for me that I worked on for the bulk of 10 years. Now, the company went out of business. It was a failure. And it's sad because, of course, Zulu for hope being its name, what do you do when hope fails? And yet I think that its kind of project and its successes and failures still gives us an interesting window into the pharmaceutical landscape globally, as well as kind of the promise and the possibility and the challenges of, kind of diversifying that, expanding its frame. So a couple of the chapters here highlight this particular moment of science for a post-apartheid South Africa that was happening, in this period of the 20-teens. And then also this idea of African solutions for African problems. So this multiracial team of scientists working on the ground in Johannesburg was very much responding to an imperative from the post-apartheid moment, right? So this idea of a rainbow nation, although the scientists did also come from other sub-Saharan African countries, this idea that, we could build a future for South Africa that would be socially just and equitable. And it would also transform South African science, which had been built up to a tremendous degree during apartheid, would transform that science to meeting the needs of just the minority, the elite minority of South Africans who were part of global networks of science and technology, and instead be accountable to the majority. So to the Black majority who had been excluded from both participating in science and from the objects of science. Now, I think that this is an important kind of moment to think about why you need an anti-racist as well as a decolonial approach to thinking about access to medicines. So folks are probably familiar with the landmark case, Big Pharma versus Nelson Mandela, in which 39 drug companies sued the South African government to prevent the Nelson Mandela government from importing drugs from India. Now, I think sometimes we don't think long enough about the strangeness of this, right? Why were they asking just for the access to import, not for the ability to make the drugs themselves? And what kind of was going on in this situation? You can see behind a real icon of this exhibit. So Nelson Mandela, of course, in the foreground of the slide, Zaki Ahmed in the background of the slide. And I think that his role is really important in understanding how this needs to play out in an intersectional way. So Zaki Ahmed had been an anti-apartheid activist, but then became a HIV access activist. And while the drugs were still unaffordable in South Africa, he himself refused to take them, even though he could have. Right, so he, as part of a globally mobile, internationally networked group of people, could have accessed the drugs for himself, but he refused to do so until the vast majority of South Africans would also have access. And so this, I think, is an interesting kind of thing for us to think about. So the reason that South African pharma joined the lawsuit on Big Pharma's side, not on the South African side, is that they had a legacy of serving the South African elite. And so the demand to transform the South African pharmaceutical industry to serve the masses is one that is also about an anti-racist demand to have inclusion in access to medicines for all of South Africans, not just for the elites. And so, these kind of multinational campaigns, so I've included the slides from MSF, but there were also, of course, South African Treatment Action Campaign where Zaki Ahmed was. And, these working together need to demand not only access for South Africa, but access for the people of South Africa. And in order to do that, we really need to remember anti-racism as well as anti-colonialism. So, and I think that we need to maybe think about whether we move beyond this demand, as important as it is, that millions of people rely on affordable medicines from India to stay alive. That's great, but why is it that we have to rely on India rather than having Africans also participate in finding solutions to their own diseases and to really kind of expand much further, right? So this is an important step to allow the South African government to import drugs from India, but it's maybe not enough. I mean, maybe, and I think that in this moment of vaccine access debates, we are seeing much more radical demand to not only kind of allow India to be the pharmacy of the developing world, but also to, to radically rethink even whether that might be too constricted. And so, one of the kind of fundamental arguments from that book was that we need to question the bifurcation in global health discourse. So including in our access to medicines kind of movements. So I'm not sure how well you can see this on the slide, but Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, which I was, supporter of and stuff as when I was a PhD student at MIT, they had this motto, which I hadn't really sufficiently questioned, saying our drugs, our labs, our responsibility. And I think that's a really important thing to say, to say that, okay, PhD students and others, at these elite universities are making the drugs in our labs. And so therefore it's our responsibility to find that we share them. And yet I think that there's also a problem of a potential for a continuance of a colonial narrative. And so, that, I mean, in the book, I use anthropology jargon, right, to talk about this with that there's an epistemic scaffolding that happens, right? So an assumption about where knowledge will be made that assumes that knowledge has to be made in the global north, and the challenge is only to spread the benefit. And I think that, the time is really ripe to think about, okay, do we have to assume that knowledge can only be made in the global north? Or, can we assume that a different kind of subject position might be available, including for those who are at institutions in Africa? So this is, this kind of argument about, can we extend our anti-racist and decolonial frame to demand African access both to medicines, as important as that is, but can we also think about the role of medical knowledge making? So I'll, leave you with that. We can come back to that in Q&A to talk a little bit about, at the same time, we should also remember that lack of access to medicines is also a deadly problem within the belly of the beast. So the United States, which, as you can tell from my voice, is my home country. And so that's one of the themes that comes up in my second book. So not all of the elements of sickening talk about drugs, but a few do, and access to medicines. And this really underscores the ways in which patents themselves are not the whole story, that if we don't really meaningfully expand access to authentic inclusion of all people in the medical and healthcare systems, and in indeed all systems, we won't really have the access to medicines that we need. So this book considers the 21st century. So starts with September 11th, 2001, and actually an event that happened in October of 2001, which not a lot of people really remember, I think because, the attacks on the World Trade Center and so on were so much kind of larger. But there were these events the following month in which anthrax was sent through the mail, and 2 postal workers died. And this chapter kind of looks at why that happened. Opening, and it really is informed by this 911 call that's so poignant, where one of the 2 postal workers recorded his unsuccessful effort to get medical care. So and of course, we as listeners know that he will die several hours later, but we're hearing, what his experience is. And he describes saying that, he works at this postal service where the letter, one of the letters containing anthrax went through, describes, his proximity to what he believes might have been anthrax, and he knows the symptoms. He has reported those. He went to the doctor, but the doctor dismissed his concerns and said, okay, just take Tylenol. It's probably just a virus. And so that decision of the healthcare system is also key. So there's two denials of access here. The first is from the governmental employers who shut down the Senate and gave Cipro to the dogs. I mean, it was a crazy situation where there was excessive treatment at the Capitol and lack of treatment for the postal workers who were known to be at risk or should have been known to be at risk. But then also their doctors. So even going to the doctor and saying, I have reason to believe I'm at risk, and not being taken seriously is also happening. And I think that, we need to remember that, distrust in the medical system is not just a legacy of a horrific history. It's also a constantly lived present that happens from these kinds of circumstances. And so that denial of access to care, I think in the belly of the beast in Washington, D.C., like walking distance from key places in the decisions around health policy are, that lack of access happens even there. Another chapter that talks about drugs is about Hurricane Katrina, so the unnatural disaster. And I think that this is actually an interesting moment in the time of the novel coronavirus to rethink, the way that global health actors have understood risk and what we need access to. So in the immediate wake of Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of worry about infectious diseases and whether infectious diseases might have a, spark of an outbreak after Hurricane Katrina, so, kind of looking at the flooding and the loss of infrastructure. But as we have seen in the years since, we've actually seen instead the excessive morbidity and mortality comes from chronic disease. So heart disease and diabetes in particular, as well as other conditions. And so how could that happen? How could a natural disaster cause an increase in chronic disease, in cardiovascular disease and diabetes, for example? And so in that, I talk about the ways in which the pharmaceutical flows and the structural racism faced by those who were impacted by Hurricane Katrina are deeply intertwined. So I heard, for example, about a case of denial of access to pharmaceuticals at the Superdome, where many people had gone to try to find shelter in the storm, where National Guard troops threw away any pharmaceuticals that were not in their original packaging. And they did this out of concern about drugs, right? So they thought, okay, there is a danger about drugs entering the Superdome. And I mean, this is such a outrageous thing, right? So to think about, okay, even if it were true that impoverished elderly people in poor health were bringing recreational drugs into the Superdome, the idea that preventing that would be more important than maintaining their access to drugs that was, that were put in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, kind of, pill packs, that kind of risk benefit was part of the broader framing of the people impacted by Katrina as criminals who needed to be controlled rather than as human beings who needed care. So this was also connected to the ways in which structural racism informed the ways that the Katrina survivors were framed as refugees. And they were given inappropriate stockpiles and drug donation programs, which we see happen all the time in global health as well. So it routinely happens that drug companies give expired medicines to drug donation programs, or really inappropriate medicines that we've decided aren't good enough for use in the United States or the United Kingdom. And the way that these were used in Katrina, I argue, is really intertwined with the framing of those survivors as refugees rather than as citizens, right? So the they get kind of caught up in a really colonial kind of narrative that is we see all the time in global health, in which refugees are considered to be kind of at the benefit of the host, but also at the discretion of the host, and in a very precarious situation. And then finally, this kind of disruption of already tenuous access. So the care that people impacted by Katrina received before the storm and before the disruption of the infrastructure was already just barely managing their heart conditions and diabetes. And so that intensified marginalization that happened as they were dispersed, exacerbated that still further. And so that we see, this ways in which, this is just one window that pharmaceutical flows allow into understanding the ways in which structural racism negatively impacted the health and maybe even the humanity of the people most impacted by Hurricane Katrina. So I think that, what I really want to kind of leave you with today is kind of a little, a message to think about is the ways in which in both South Africa and in the United States, unequal access to medicines is emblematic of unequal access to citizenship. And so we need to kind of keep our attention on both of those at the same time. That if we demand only access to medicines without attending to the ways in which people are systematically excluded from full citizenship, we simply won't reach the goal of health for all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was really interesting. I didn't know about a lot of those stories, and it's quite disturbing as well to hear that this is still happening in such organized systemic ways. So I'm sure everyone here I'm sure we all felt quite moved by that. Thank you. Next up we have Achal Prabhala, who is a coordinator at Access IBSA, which is a project that campaigns for access to medicines in India, Brazil, and South Africa. He's also co-founder of UAEM, having helped organize the first meeting of students from different universities at Yale. He writes regularly on the topic, and we're really excited to hear from him today. So without further ado, over to you, Achal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here, firstly. It's just such a lovely feeling to speak to all of you who are students who are getting into this, probably far more in depth than I did when I was a student. And I feel about 20 years younger already. And so I am delighted to be here. And I wish you really the very best in this work, in the activism that you're doing and the concern that you show here, and in the future for everything that you do, armed with this kind of consciousness, which I think is just invaluable. It changed my own student career. It changed my life. I didn't intend to spend the last 18 years working on access to medicines and earning very little money, but that is how it happened, and I wouldn't change a thing. I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about how I fell into this hole. And the way that I did in my case was in 2001, I worked for a brief while as a journalist in a small West Indian country in Guyana. And just by almost pure accident, came upon this very odd situation where Guyana, which is a tiny country with immense racial strife, because half its population is of Indian origin and half its population is of African origin. I worked for a newspaper that was, I think, perceived as being a newspaper where African intellectuals wrote, which was a problem for me, but it was the best newspaper in the country. And was struggling to find a way to create access to medicines for HIV and AIDS, which this really tiny country with a population of less than 1 million people. I live in Bangalore, in a city where some neighborhoods here have more than 1 million people. So it's just very hard to wrap my head around a country that size, but it's also very hard for any country that size to have any kind of serious clout when it comes to getting things that they need and being heard on the international stage. What Guyana had was very little money, a large HIV and AIDS problem, and absolutely no way of treating it in any feasible medical sense. The tragedy with this was, of course, that in 1996, what used to be a death sentence had become a manageable chronic condition, something that you could live your life out very easily on, like diabetes. I'm old enough to remember what newspaper headlines around HIV and AIDS looked like before 1996. There were hollowed out faces of people who were either dead or dying, because that was really the only way in which a diagnosis of being HIV positive ended up. There have been very moving stories and films written about this period. Larry Kramer's A Normal Heart, which started as a play, then became an HBO film, which is actually really rather good. And what it inspired was the activism of many, many young people like yourselves in the United States to join groups like ACT UP and demand of their very conservative governments at that time in the United States that they invest money in this, at the time, deadly and incurable disease, which was killing a group of people who the United States government didn't care for very much. If you were somebody who was even middle class, white, and gay in the United States in the 1980s and the 1990s, early 1990s, when this disease ravaged the country, your standing with your state was actually very poor. And that was certainly a part of the reason why it wasn't a priority at the US government to invest in finding treatments for it. But through the brave activism of young people, which is chronicled in a beautiful film, which if you haven't seen, I urge you to see, called How to Survive a Plague, made by David France. It released about 8 or 9 years ago. And it's absolutely worth every minute of your time. Due to the hard work of activists who literally put their bodies on the line, there was a miracle. By 1996, there were treatments that had been developed for managing HIV and AIDS as a chronic condition. These drugs were called antiretrovirals. Andrew Sullivan, a very prominent journalist at the time, wrote a piece in the New York Times saying, this is how plagues end, because it was the end of the plague. Now, the problem was that it was the end of the plague for people who had $10,000 a year to afford the antiretroviral medication that had been discovered. And in 1996, we also found that the demographics of HIV and AIDS dramatically shifted. So what used to be thought of as a disease that affected gay white men in Europe and the United States suddenly was primarily a problem of Asia, of Latin America, and in enormous proportions, sub-Saharan Africa. And none of these countries, very few of these countries, had anything close to $10,000 a year per person to provide. Not the people didn't have it, the governments didn't have it. A rich government like South Africa, which is really among the richest countries in sub-Saharan Africa, did not have anything close to that kind of money. So what happened between 1996 and 2004, when the South African government finally could afford to create a mass public treatment program, the kind of program, as Anne Pollock movingly reminded us just a few minutes ago, Zaki Ahmad and other brave activists withstood and put their own lives on the line in order to achieve. It had been 8 years since this treatment was available, right? It takes 17 hours to fly from New York to Johannesburg. It took 8 years for these medicines to make the journey. And the reason it took 8 years is because they were just too expensive. They were expensive because of these ceaseless, cruel, unrelenting pharmaceutical monopolies that are held up by sovereign states the world over, that are enforced across the world by governments like the United States and the United Kingdom, where you are, which have caused death and destruction over the last 25 years of human existence at a really unprecedented scale, in a manner that we have not yet fully accounted for, in a manner that we have not yet come to terms with, in a manner that we are yet to learn anything from, as the evidence of our story of access to vaccines in the coronavirus pandemic shows. When I became a graduate student at Yale in New Haven, I was excited by the fact that just a year before me, a young colleague of mine, a friend of mine, who's now a professor of law at Yale, Amy Kopczynski, who really is the co-founder of UAEM, had led a battle to have Yale relax its stronghold, its monopoly stronghold on a drug called stabudine, one of these key antiretroviral medicines that form this $10,000 diamond necklace that could save you, and had succeeded at it to the extent that Yale put pressure on Bristol Myers Squibb, the company that it had licensed this drug to say, look, you've just got to allow generic manufacturers in South Africa to make this drug at a 20th of the cost, which they did. Not after a long, long fight persuading them to do so. So what we did, we realized at that time in 2002 that we should turn this kind of a one-off win into actual policy change. Universities are public institutions. Yale is a public institution. It is not meant to run as a pharmaceutical company, and yet many aspects of Yale are run in that fashion. And the reason they are is partly due to the fact that in the early 1980s, the United States enacted legislation called the Bidol Act. Almost 5 to 6 years later, the United Kingdom enacted very similar legislation with similar intent. What happened in the US and the UK in the kind of heyday of almost sort of capitalism's last hurrah, because it was the last decade where both capitalism and communism existed as simultaneous global forces, it was almost like there was a point to prove. And with Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, what happened was there was a large-scale divestment of government involvement and responsibility in their citizens' lives. And this happened across the scale, by the way. I mean, from everything from water regulation to air quality to industrial regulation to how the government should exercise its responsibility over these vast public funds. And by the way, when we say public funds, we mean taxpayer money, right? So this is your money. So essentially, anyone who's on this is your money. How they should exercise their responsibility to that money when it goes to creating life-saving pharmaceuticals. And incredibly, the way that they decided to do it was to say they must hand it over to pharmaceutical corporations without absolutely any involvement, so that it can then come to market as a drug or a vaccine as purely private property that belongs to that corporation, in effect, making you, the taxpayer, pay twice for it, at the very least, right? But never mind, because that is the most efficient way to make sure that we can get these drugs to market. That is the most effective way of using public funds. Very few people knew enough to be able to argue against this in the 1980s. Now, 30 years later, we know a lot. There are all kinds of ways in which government can still enact its responsibility, and historically, it's just been prevented from doing so. It can step in. The United Kingdom can step in. The United States can step in. They rarely do. And they rarely do because they have become captured in a sense that is more than just legal and financial, but also emotional, in a way where this particular form of neoliberal abandonment of responsibility on the part of the state has actually become an intellectual rationale for why this state works. That's how dangerous these seeds of philosophy have been, and they have been responsible in the past largely for deaths all around the world, but increasingly for deprivation of access to medicines in the very places that they were conceived. I was enraged by this as a student. I think that for me, while I was learning about these issues, it was really just a very basic, simple thing. You had these medicines, they existed. You had people who were dying because they couldn't get them. The only reason they couldn't get them because they were too expensive. Of course, initially I started off thinking, well, maybe there's a reason they're so expensive. And then you find out that there isn't, that there are these public funds that go into creating these medicines, that there are alternatives to these medicines that cost 20 or 25 times less. And that there's simply no moral rationale anywhere in the world that could justify why they should be withheld from people who need them in order to live another day. It did seem to me when I was younger like the most important problem in the world. It did seem like, it really did. It was like waking up every morning and thinking about how is it possible that the world is just continuing and carrying on when this problem exists? I mean, it's just, there was something absurd about it, right? And it really inflamed me. And I worked on this. We convened students from other universities. We had the first sort of proto-UAEM meeting where I hosted students in my house and others did. And that led to this beautiful organization, and at least in part led to the amazing student activism that we can see here today. And I'm so proud of you and so happy that you're here. Let me summarize what the coronavirus vaccine access situations looks like today in order to set the stage for the last 5 minutes of what I want to talk about. You have a situation where you have the richest countries in the world, which are about 15 to 20% of the world's population, who have multiple options on vaccines, right? They have options ranging from about 9 vaccine doses per citizen, like Canada does, to about 6 doses per citizen, like the United Kingdom does. Now, even though all of these rich countries have these options on vaccines, not all of them are doing equally well in terms of receiving those vaccines and putting them out. The United Kingdom is doing excellently. The United States is doing very, very well. Other countries like Israel have done very well because they've simply paid double the price of the Pfizer vaccines to get them very quickly. There's one other exception to a country that's doing very well, but I'll get to that last. Canada and the European Union are doing very badly for rich countries who've cornered the market, right? So what the tragedy in Canada and the European Union is that not only did they do nothing to help any other country outside the West get access to these vaccines, they themselves, after expending billions of dollars in these pre-orders and research grants and other kinds of stimulus to pay for these vaccines, have actually got very little in return. They're not even the first priority for these vaccine companies among rich countries. And I think it must hurt to find yourself at the back of the line of the rich queue, right? However, whatever it is that's happening in rich countries cannot be worse than what's happening in the poorest countries on earth. These are countries that are labeled either low income or lower middle income in the clinical, technical language of, let's say, the World Bank classifications. In these countries, if you took India out of it, because India is an anomaly, we have a lot of people, we have a lot of things here, we have a lot of vaccine manufacturing here, and as a result of which, there is just a very strange, anomalous situation that's unfolding in India. And if any of you are interested in this, by the way, my colleague and I wrote a piece on this last week for The Guardian, which is how India, within the group of countries who are poor like it, is now behaving essentially as an imperial power by withholding vaccines to go out to about a third of humanity, which is all the other poor countries who are depending on India for their vaccines. But in the poorest countries, what's happening is that very few countries have received enough vaccinations to be able to even think of returning to normalcy. The standard is, in fact, something as shockingly low as about 1% of the population having enough vaccination doses. That is not a solution, that's a trickle, and that's a shame. This is despite multilateral initiatives funded with billions of dollars, like the COVAX facility, which is run by the World Health Organization and an organization called Gavi, the Vaccines Alliance, and CEPI, which is really got the worst name in the world. It's the Coalition for Epidemic, Preparedness, Innovations. And every time I say that aloud, I think, it's just very surprising that they didn't find the person who named it that and then put them in jail for the rest of their lives. But nevertheless, the COVAX facility runs the largest philanthropic program to get vaccines to poor countries. But last year, what happened is they had these promises saying that they had this, they were on it and that they would take care of it. And even this year, they boast that they will have 2 billion doses out to cover 20% of all people in poor countries by the end of this year. Well, we're 4 months into this year, and to date, they've sent out 18 million vaccines to countries other than India. And as far as track records go, it's really quite simple in terms of mathematics. You have 18 million doses out in 4 months. It is very difficult to believe that you're going to have 2 billion doses out at the end of the year. And even if you did, that is a broken promise, because this is a pandemic in which every day counts. Every day counts in terms of lives and livelihoods, even in lowest income countries. And it is as much of a betrayal to delay supply as to deny supply. So that's the situation in poor countries. It's horrendous. There are very few options. In middle income countries, what's really interesting is that they, having been put outside the queue for Western vaccines, and being too rich in a way to qualify for WHO and COVAX charity, went to Russia and China. And what they did is they went to 2 specific vaccines in China, Sinopharm, which is a state-owned Chinese pharmaceutical manufacturer, its Beijing vaccine, and Sinovac, which is a private company, its CoronaVac vaccine. In Russia, they went for Sputnik V, which is a state-developed vaccine from a biotherapeutics lab and the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. Together, the Russian and Chinese vaccines have created a supply chain of about 1 billion doses each in this year alone, in 2021. They've made deals for close to the same number. The Chinese vaccines manufacturers have started delivering huge quantities. All of them, all three of them, the Russian manufacturer, the two Chinese manufacturers, have set up really interesting arrangements where for small countries who don't have the possibility of supplying themselves, they ship from China or Russia. But for other countries, what they've done is they've created licensing agreements where they share their technology. So very big, well-established middle-income countries like Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, all of them are making the Chinese vaccine already. They're making Sinovac, one of the Chinese vaccines. And what they're doing, therefore, is transferring the technology to these countries to take care of themselves. It's a far more interesting model. It's not open source. It's also not even nonprofit. None of these companies are angels, let me just say, yeah? They're companies. It's just that they're dealing with a more interesting crowd and they're doing it in a more interesting way. And it's something that we should recognize and respect. One of the anomalous high-income countries that has achieved an astonishing degree of something like 65% of its population having been vaccinated is the United Arab Emirates. And I was there over the New Year's at a small fishing island deep in the Emirates, and every 3 or 4 days, I would pass a long line of thousands of cars outside something called Festival City near Dubai, where there were literally about something close to about 10,000 people a day in cars getting vaccinated with Sinopharm, the other Chinese vaccine. And it really did change my mind in a sense as to what these vaccines were worth. I spent some time working on this with a colleague of mine in Malaysia. We published a piece in the New York Times mid-February, I think, called "It's Time to Trust China's and Russia's Vaccines." I'd urge you to read that if you haven't. There's something astonishing going on here, which I think we must pay attention to. And I'd like to end with 2 minutes on this to talk about how we can think about enabling an infrastructure to support and make credible pharmaceutical research and innovation that happens outside the West, because I think that is an absolutely crucial element of how we heal ourselves. I'm so happy that it connects so well to what Pollock just said, and will certainly feed into what I'm very much looking forward to hear in terms of what Tammam Aloudat will say. I do sincerely believe if there's one good thing that could come out of this pandemic, it is a broadening of the sphere of pharmaceutical innovation, the places from which we believe pharmaceutical innovation can emerge, which so far, by the way, has been solely the Western world. The World Health Organization has really archaic rules in terms of how it gives credibility to non-Western pharmaceuticals. They function on this idea of a strict regulatory authority, which is essentially Europe, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States. If a vaccine is not approved in one of these legislations, it has to go through an arduous and totally unnecessary process, which involves multiple factory visits, something to 7 to 8 months in order for it to be approved. The Sputnik vaccine entered the WHO queue in August of last year. It will leave at the earliest something like June or July this year. Pfizer, on the other hand, entered in November, left in December. J&J entered in, I think, February, left in March. So if you're a Western vaccine approved by a Western regulator, you jump through the hoops. If you are a non-Western vaccine, you have to really work at it and suffer a lot in order to be qualified in some way or certified for global use by the WHO. The problem is that we all suffer from this. This is not a Western problem. We went through this in some detail. Honestly, there were surveys of people in India or in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's not like poor people want poor country vaccines necessarily, right? They very much actually want the Western vaccine over any Indian vaccine. We have a choice here in India right now of an indigenous Indian vaccine and a Western vaccine, and which is the AstraZeneca vaccine. And despite all of the problems that it's having in Europe and the United Kingdom, it is the preferred choice. It's our Pfizer vaccine, because regardless of your income, you want the Western product, not the dubious Indian product. So there is an already established mindset across the world, not just in the West, which automatically views pharmaceutical products outside the West as being dubious and suspicious and lacking credibility. The problem is that we have a vast infrastructure at organizations like the World Health Organization that support this idea, that promote this idea, and make it impossible for innovation to flourish outside the West. And let me tell you what that innovation looks like. A lot of people have particular problems with Russia and China because of their human rights records. Shockingly, the same people don't have the same problems with Cuban and Indian vaccines, presumably because there are no human rights violations in these countries. But there are vaccines that are coming out from Cuba, from India, in addition to Russia and China, from Vietnam, from Thailand, from Iran. So there is a vast amount of innovation that is happening around the coronavirus vaccines out of the incredible exigency that this situation has created. But there is no infrastructure, there is not enough of a network of support and credibility to move this innovation forward. If we could disperse the center of pharmaceutical innovation, move it outside the West, it would be better for everyone, including the West. The idea that we have solved problems in Europe, in North America, in the United Kingdom is absurd. I worked on a one-year campaign for access to Orkambi, a cystic fibrosis drug, which middle-class white families that I worked alongside simply couldn't afford. And it was an incredible tragedy to watch until the battle was finally won. The truth is that all of us suffer from this problem. We just suffer to it from different degrees. And to the extent that we can encourage pharmaceutical innovation to come from as many places in the world, we'll have more competition, we'll have more options. But we have to take that idea seriously and work on finding solutions for it, because that would help everybody, not just in poor countries, but including in very rich ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Achal. That was really interesting. And insightful, because I think there is this, implicit belief that the Western vaccines are more trusted, more regulated, more desirable than other vaccines. And it's really great that you have, and you've allowed us and encouraged us to challenge that implicit belief. So yeah, I'm sure we'll have questions on that later. Next up, we have Dr. Tammam Aloudat, who is the Senior Strategic Advisor to MSF Access Campaigns and is a Syrian medical doctor and public health expert. He also has a breadth of experience in the field, having worked for the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement. And he has experience working for MSF in the field and in the headquarters. So over to you, Tammam.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria, and thanks for having me here today, and for putting me last, so I have to follow up on two incredible speeches, but I'll try my best. The talk today is about the intersectionality of access to medicines. And this is a very interesting topic because it puts together things that we aren't usually prepared to address. So most of us who work on access to medicines come to it from looking at the exact injustices that that Achal described and that Anne described. I'm sorry, I'll use first names if you'll allow me. And that's important because as physicians, we have to face challenges to our core need and urge to treat patients that we face. What we aren't trained for is to look beyond the biological. And what I'll try to talk about in the next 10 to 20 minutes, well, 15 minutes, let's say, is how is it that we have been brought first into a situation where we look at our patients exclusively as from a biomedical angle, and how that contradicts any of our urges to actually treat them well. And what do we do about it? And I'll put that in hopefully a frame of that intersectional approach. So I studied medicine in Syria in the late 90s, and we had selective topics, and little did I know that I will do tropical medicine for the rest of my life. The topic on tropical diseases was impossible. We never saw patients with those diseases, so it was very difficult for us to study. And we had a choice of what to be tested on. So you could exclude some topics, and I did exclude that because I just couldn't get the book into my head when I haven't seen the patients. And instead, I picked the easy one, which everybody picks, which is the ethics. And it was easy because it was about 30-page book that was given to us in a couple of lectures, and the professor pretty much recycled the same questions every year. So everybody did that. Little we've learned about ethics at all. Again, little did I know that that would become part of my everyday life. So then many of us end up working in the health systems of our own countries or societies, and that is fine. And that's reasonably easy because at least in Western settings, the expectation builds on you knowing exactly what to do as a biomedicine expert. And that I say that very intentionally. There has been a move towards creating physicians who are algorithms. You are a diagnosis and treatment algorithm. You have familiar people from familiar backgrounds where you have to diagnose and treat with whatever you have at hand. What you have at hand is something that has been decided by health economists and planners that write your guidelines. So if you end up working in the NHS, you treat what you know is treatable according to your situation and what's available to you. And you don't bother with the choices. And that's a very good place to be if you want to sleep at night. And then the other point is I worked in humanitarian settings all my career. And you go to a project, to a hospital or a clinic in one of the places where the Red Cross or MSF works. And suddenly you are taken out of that familiarity, the familiarity with your patients, the familiarity with the conditions they come with, and the familiarity with what you can and can't do without having to bother too much. Now, if you are in a hospital in MSF, first, you don't have many planners to decide what you can and cannot treat. You have much more leeway, and you have to make choices about who gets treatment and who doesn't. And that is much more difficult because by making a choice to treat someone, you're making a choice to not treat someone else. The finite resources and massive needs imply that. And I'll give you a couple of examples where we've done badly, unintentionally. We worked in Central African Republic. We had a sexual and reproductive health unit which treated sexual violence. And this is something that we've come to after many decades of negligence of sexual violence in emergencies. Then we realized, having worked there for quite a while, that many men who were subjected to sexual violence and rape as a weapon of war in Central African Republic were not coming to get treatment because the perception was that it was only for women. And that was an unintended exclusion that has happened by our lack of understanding of the context. We didn't know how prolific was the use of rape on men and boys, and we didn't know to tell them that the treatment is open for all. So while we were pretty happy about ourselves doing one thing, we have been failing at doing something else. Another example is, I was once in a mobile clinic in South Sudan, and the mobile clinic goes, and once a week they're beside a village, people gather to get treatment, and our treatment was mostly for children. We've never done enough advocacy on what do we treat and what should people ask us for. And we had a lady whose 3 weeks old child was starting to get malnourished. And when I was walking among the patients and doing the initial triage, and this lady didn't look well. She showed me the child, and I asked her, how is she feeling? It turns out she had an abscess that is a result of mastitis that she's been suffering for 10 days. Now, we had to rush her to the hospital and get her into surgery very fast. She would have probably died within days of that if she wasn't treated. And what boggles the mind is people don't ask the way they do as you expect them. If you have been in a waiting room in a Western hospital, you would have heard people, nagging and yelling and complaining about not being seen immediately and about the wait times. There is a sense of entitlement that is entirely different from healthcare. I can give you examples forever, and I've haggled with each one of them. I've struggled with having to send patients with cancer back home without pain management. We've done a lot of research and campaigning on pain management that now it is part of the agenda. But all that, the description of how HIV medicines weren't available. And then afterwards, we have many current examples like tuberculosis new medicines, like hepatitis C new medicines that cost tens of thousands of dollars to treat, are still not available for diseases that are massively influential. There are around 75 million people with hepatitis C in the world now. Only about 1.5 million are getting treatment with Gilead's sofosbuvir, which started costing about $85,000 in the US. Let that sink in. That's $80,000 per course of treatment. Andrew Hill, a professor who works on cost of production of medicines, which is kept secret by the companies, has figured that it costs about $120 to make. And the UK, it costs, to my last information, about £26,000 for a single treatment, or that was at least a couple of years ago before we were swept with COVID. And the UK NHS doesn't have access to enough treatments for the patients in the UK. This is the 5th largest economy in the world. So how does that translate into intersectionality? We cannot, my argument here is we cannot understand medicine or provide access that is fair and equitable without understanding the multidimensional issues that weigh on access. Anne talked about race being one of them, and that is absolutely the case. And Achal talked about the difference between what Anne called the belly of the beast, and imagine if that's the case in the US, then how would it be in poorer countries? And my argument is when people start calling global health a colonial thing that needs decolonization, there are two responses. One is this is nothing like colonialism, and colonialism is an invasion that includes extraction and exploitation, and global health actually wants to do something nice. Now, it might not achieve it all the time, but it is a well-meaning thing. Now, the other is, okay, this has colonial aspects to it that have to be explored. But let's examine the first one for a little second. Global health is not a colonial entity. It doesn't aim to exploit and extract, and it is actually well-meaning. This is the formal definition of global health, a system of providing healthcare equity to people beyond borders. I would argue that this might be a slightly naive and unrealistic because the global health is as well a system of power actors who have many privileges and who have different agendas. Global health, which we'll talk about for a minute, is actually not one thing. First, it still academically lacks a definition. So you will go to Twitter and you'd follow a few people and you'll find all kinds of how people define themselves. From a global health worker to a global health guru to a person passionate about global health. I would love to do an experiment where people who have global health in their titles are define it in a way, and for us not to judge the accuracy of their definition, but to judge the disparity of the definitions that we got. But at least in the literature, there aren't many definitive definitions, but there are distinctions. And one of the distinctions was written by Andrew Lakoff in 2010, who said that actually there are two global health regimes. One of them he calls humanitarian biomedicine, which attempts to treat people's diseases beyond rich countries as they are needed. And this is where we try to provide access to medicines on HIV drugs for the populations that, Achal described HIV patients in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and provide treatment for diseases that are now called neglected tropical diseases like Kala-Azar and sleeping sickness and others that lack not only affordable medicines, but medicines altogether because no one bothers doing the research and development. Then Lakoff described another one, which he calls the global health security regime. And this is what you see every day. When the world springs into action to provide vaccine for COVID, it's not because suddenly everybody has become benevolent and philanthropic. It is a security apparatus that allows rich countries to protect themselves. The difference between the two is that the humanitarian biomedicine goes and finds ways to treat patients with existing diseases in the way they need it, hopefully. The global health security is not about diseases that exist. It's about identifying diseases as they emerge and containing them from reaching rich countries or affecting rich countries. And if we understand it this way, then we might find an easier time figuring out how is the COVID vaccine and treatments and diagnostics are so poorly distributed because they aren't meant to be distributed. And this is a global health system that is colonialist. Now, I will show you for a second a quote by Aimé Césaire, who is one of the anti-colonial gurus. He comes from the Martinique. And what he said is a civilization that proves incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization, a civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems is a stricken civilization, a civilization that uses its principles for trickery and deceit is a dying civilization. Now, this is obviously a poetic quote, and Aimé Césaire was a poet, but he was also one of the first clear voices in anti-colonialist movements earlier in the 20th century. And what we could use of colonialism as a concept is understanding how things intersect. Colonialism is by its nature racist, as Anne said. Colonialism is something that looks at dehumanizing the others, at thingifying the others. You cannot invade people and extract and exploit them. You cannot enact slavery or genocides or any form of any of the forms that colonialism that taken while seeing people as equal. And this is the first thing which we could consider. Global health today doesn't see people as equal. If there was a real conception of everybody in the world as equal, we wouldn't be constrained with national borders and providing vaccines. In the UK today, you have I think you have the highest vaccine rate in the world, providing vaccines to young, healthy people at little threat, while healthcare workers in most of the world do not have vaccines yet. Putting aside the argument about the epidemiology and the fact that, or the assumption that COVID is worse in the rich world than it is in the poor, which is being used as an argument for vaccinating in the West and not in the global South. This is not true simply because we don't know. In Syria, where I come from, my father had COVID in autumn, and he wasn't registered because people don't get tested, because testing is not available, because people are afraid of the repercussions of being found positive, because they can't afford the $100 that the PCR test costs, and so on and so on. But if you look at my timeline on any of the social media, you'll find so many of the families of friends and my family friends dying at a higher rate. And it's hard to think that the wave of the older people dying is unrelated to COVID, but we cannot prove it. So the epidemiology trickery that is being used to say the West is much more stricken by the global South is not necessarily well informed. So what of colonialism makes sense? We have to understand a few things. One is knowledge. How is knowledge produced? Anne mentioned the epistemic scaffolding that is used to justify some of this. And this is interesting because, as doctors, again, we are not taught to understand or look after the what Anne you call the anthropological jargon, which took me years to start to understand some, but that is essential to us being able to figure our place if we are working on global health. Epistemology is how we know. It's how we know things and what knowledge makes sense and what knowledge is usable in our life. And in global health, the knowledge, the epistemology that is dominant is one of biomedicine, of thinking of people as organs, and is one that is governed by accepting a framework of the strong is strong countries and individuals, and the weak needs help. It is one that accepts the neoliberalism, the hyper-capitalist system that we still live under, and wants to navigate within all that and provide some more equity. So rather than calling people who work in global health bad because they work in a colonialist system, we have to understand the restraints that they are under and what space of navigation. We still assume most of the knowledge will be produced in the West and will be hopefully at some point useful for the global South. And I would ask you to look at some literature on knowledge in global health. In BMJ Global Health, Shea Bimbola wrote a few pieces on knowledge. And I'll write his name in the chat just because I think one written 2 years ago about the gaze, which gaze is useful. And another written about a week ago about the use of knowledge in global health, are really useful in understanding how knowledge is constructed, so those restrictions on global health are accepted. But then the governance is another part after knowledge. And the governance is one that assumes that global health as it is now is fine. And let me draw an image. Global health is governed by organizations that are almost entirely in the global north. Actually, most of them are between Washington, DC, New York, and Geneva, that are almost entirely led by white people. And if you haven't seen it, I would invite you to see the report issued on 8th of March by Global Health 50/50, which is an organization that is concerned with the gender parity in global health. And part of what they said is more than 70% of the people who lead global health organizations are white men, but more than 86% are educated in the North. I studied in London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which has its own colonial heritage that hasn't ever been denounced or apologized for. And hence I have a job in Geneva. If I had that same master's with the same content from Damascus University, I'd probably not be recruited for this. And that is still, this is creating an epistemic norm that is acceptable and that guarantees promotion. And that means that in the end of the day, who decides on who lives and who dies are usually white men who have come from privilege and who have no conception of the risks or lives of people that they are deciding on the behalf of. And one example is Gavi, which Achal mentioned, that has been led for a very long time by Seth Berkley, an American citizen who is quite privileged and who has at the tip of his hands the influence on millions and millions of people that can or cannot get vaccines. And he decided that Gavi decided that GDP would be the threshold on which they provide or not provide vaccines at prices that are affordable. So for a while, any country that crossed a certain GDP per capita and This is another thing. As medics, we don't understand those terms. GDP is one of the worst measures of actual well-being of populations. It's a measure of the well-being of the market, not of the people. But it has been used to deprive people from subsidies on vaccines. Hence, many countries that graduated, and notice the use of terms, from Gavi support had a massive drop in vaccines. And now they give countries time to graduate. And then practice. What we are faced with is the conclusion of a system that functions and is functions in a framework that is hyper-capitalist, racist, discriminatory, whereby we haven't yet seen an agreement on actually that colonialism is about to start with. And just a couple of days ago, a journalist who's called Matthew Paris published in the Time an article that's saying everybody wants to decolonize, not me, I am proud of the empire. This is the same genocidal empire that caused death and destruction. I didn't continue the article because I don't want to pay for the time or, you know, spoil my week, but this is still a common discourse and common in, you know, quasi-intellectuals like this, but also common in practices that you know, leak sometimes. And one of the leaks of those practices is the famous Boris Johnson's slip into reciting Kipling when he was in Myanmar. He started reciting the poet of colonialism in an ex-colonial country in front of people there, and has to be shushed by the ambassador. And this is available online. It still is there. And that adds two layers, and I will finish here. One is colonialism, along with other means and methods of understanding the power imbalances, the asymmetries of power, whether that is a feminist gender-based one or an ecological one, with like the Extinction Rebellion, for example, or or ones that talk about other economic and societal and cultural disparities, are frameworks that we can use both as a way to understand the power imbalances that we face in global health and access to medicines, but also the literature that gives us 100 years of thought to borrow from. And those who tell you that decolonization doesn't apply and shouldn't be used and is offensive to people, should probably be argued against, because if we do not get to learn from 100 years of thought and we are asked to start from scratch in our quest to achieve health equity and access to medicine, then we are deprived of a head start, and we're asked to spend the next 20 years waiting for other thinkers to come and explain what we are suffering. And that's inappropriate. There are people dying because of lack of medicines now, and using those frameworks, whether as an intellectual exercise or as a framework for action, is inevitable and necessary. I will stop here and hopefully have some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tammam. I think that was a very powerful talk and very well brings together what we've heard so far today. Yeah, thank you. I was quite moved by that. Cool. So I think we'll move on to some questions. I know we have quite a few in the chat, but I have one just to kick off the discussion. I think, you know, obviously the pandemic has forced us to take a step back. Well, you were all already involved, but for a lot of us, it has forced us to take a step back and reimagine our approach to global health. And based on all your works, what changes would you say that we need to prioritize? I think we'll start with Anne, because I can see your face.
Sorry, I'm just finding the unmute button. So first of all, thank you so much for that amazing set of interventions, which I think, is just, I think it's always refreshing when you find that you are in a kind of dialogue on an event, even when we all approach from such different places and in different ways. So that's really great. I think, that maybe one of the things that I think we do need to change has already really been a key thread here in our conversation this morning, which is about really rethinking whether the challenge is to develop the best in the West and then send it to the rest, right? So, really, I think that we are seeing some of the shortcomings of that, which were visible before, but which now, are kind of unavoidable. And so I think that that's one of the things that we'll take away. And then I guess maybe one other thing would be to pay attention to inequalities within the rich countries and within middle-income countries and within low-income countries, and really, bringing that into more fully an approach which historically hasn't paid a lot of attention, to the ways in which inequalities within countries are in dialogue with and imbricated in and connected to global inequalities.
Yeah, absolutely. Achal, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, certainly. Look, I think for me, a revelation that occurred about 5 years ago has only solidified in the pandemic, which is that I've been working on this issue for 18 years now, fighting the pharmaceutical monopolies, the legal monopolies and the technology monopolies in the West. And what happened 5 years ago is that there was a dramatic change. Suddenly, there were middle-class white Americans fighting for access to drugs like PrEP, which you need to be able to have sex without the fear of risking HIV infection, or insulin, which a host of people who have diabetes need to live, or cystic fibrosis drugs in the United Kingdom. It was really a revelation because honestly, for the first 10, 15 years that I worked on these issues, it was a black and brown problem. We did not believe that, especially in countries with socialized healthcare, like in Europe and the United Kingdom, there were any problems at all, but there were huge problems. I think, and what it illustrated was a question of, the chickens coming home to roost in a way. These were the very governments that had thrust these policies onto us and onto the rest of the world, which were now suffering from them, and yet somehow unable to take action. And I think that sort of metastasized in the coronavirus pandemic, where you now have the European Union very much behaving like a poor country in the world, which is imposing export bans and fighting with pharmaceutical companies and talking about overturning monopolies. You have Canada, which isn't doing any of those things, but is suffering from a very low rate of vaccine supply, despite huge money and a huge pile of pre-orders, which it's simply not receiving. The interesting thing here, I think, is that we also then have these monopolies of the mind, which is that if you set up the Western pharmaceutical industry as the only solution, that itself is going to be a problem. And to that extent, I think the coverage of these non-Western vaccines, especially the Russian and Chinese vaccines, I think I was glad to play a small role in helping to change, but I think that to the extent that they are changed even more, and to the extent more innovation comes out of this emergency from countries we don't expect to really have the knowledge base to do that. When I say we don't expect, I mean, the West doesn't expect, because I do. To that extent, I think that there is something interesting that can change in this pandemic, which is the ability of people to take care of themselves, right? But this is not something I think that even, and I fully appreciate Tammam's excellent placement of the global health movement, but I think it's not something that even the global health movement has fully grappled with as yet, right? Which is the ability of people to take care of themselves, rather than setting up the entire world as being producers and users, or people who do fine and victims as the strong and the weak. And that's something I see changing for the better at the end of this pandemic, which, if it is acted upon and strengthened, will make us a more self-reliant world.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Tammam?
Thank you. Yeah, Achal, no, the global health system hasn't grappled with its problems. It still looks at the mirror and thinks, well, it sees as beautiful. and let me say a couple of things. One is, yes, the lack of access in rich countries is indicative of several things. One of them is that you cannot cut people on nationality, obviously, even in the most basic indicators. You'd assume that a UK citizen is by default better off health-wise than an Indian or a Jordanian but that's not the case always. There is the multitude of ways that our people find themselves unprivileged is mind-boggling. And race is one of them, gender is one of them, but we are facing a situation where racism has extended itself beyond the skin color and into multiple ways of tagging and identifying and categorizing people. And I mentioned an example. My being able to study in London gave me privilege that doesn't exist to someone who comes from my background. And there's a French philosopher who invented or coined the term neo-racism, Etienne Balibar. And it's interesting because the markers of education, the markers of social class, the markers of family, and so on, all of them start playing a role. That being said, when we talk about decolonizing global health, the immediate reaction is either complete resistance and denial. We are good, how could we be colonial? Which is starting to crumble. But the other one is, okay, we haven't done excellent, let's do something about it. And the immediate reaction, it's let's hire more Black and brown people. And here I just want to talk about something where we are starting to see a response where is exclusionary to white people by definition, and it thinks of the existence of people who are Black or brown as an indication of the shift in power, and all that is not the case. When people are being hired for the sake of diversity, it's more likely than not to hire people who are fully assimilated and willing to defend the system at all costs, sometimes more than the classical actors. If you want to think about that, think about Priti Patel and the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Denmark, who's a dissident who comes from Ethiopian refugee family and is deporting Syrian refugees now back to a war country. Representation is not enough. We have to understand the power structure that is mobilizing the money and the decisions and the outcomes. And within that, we will end up where we are now in another decade, whereby we have slightly more colorful boards and leaderships and equally unprivileged masses of people who don't get treated or get access to medicines or many other things. But we will have that when we are a decade closer to the climate crisis. My final word is, if we think access to medicine is bad now, think about it in 20 years or 30 years, when the endemicity of diseases have changed, when migration has doubled many, many times, and when large swaths of the earth is uninhabitable because of the climate crisis. Then we have a problem. And if we don't have a solution that privileges people who are poor and gives them agency and gives them decision and gives them means of producing their own outcomes, then we are going to have a dark period ahead. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that the idea of color and as representation is very, very much used as a measure, but we potentially need to move away from that.
Just to say, it's absolutely necessary to do that.
Yeah.
But it's not the whole measure. I'm not saying keep things as they are. We have to diversify, but that's not going to solve all our problems on its own.
I understand. Thank you. So we have a question in the chat. Okay, am I unmute? Yes. So there has been a lot of talk about low middle income countries not having enough manufacturing capacity, for example, for COVID vaccines, but also other medications. How much of this is a spin to prevent the sharing of IP and knowledge versus an important need to invest in local manufacturing? Who would like to, Achal, yeah, go for it.
Sure, I'm happy to. Look, so firstly, it is absolute spin, yeah, and I'll give you one quick example. The very best that the Western pharmaceutical industry has done to date is one license that AstraZeneca, the UK-based company that had an exclusive license on the Oxford Jenner Institute produced vaccine, has made with an Indian company called the Serum Institute for 1 billion doses in this year and another billion the next year. The other Western vaccine manufacturers have done nothing. So Pfizer and Moderna are like limousines that are passing by the scene of a crime where people are dying and not stopping. AstraZeneca actually stopped, partly because it was forced to by Oxford University, who had entered into these commitments prior to licensing their technology to AstraZeneca. Now, so I just want to say this is the best Western vaccine manufacturing model that we have. And what that is doing, because of the limited terms of that license, is delivering so far, 4 months into 2021, 18 million doses of vaccines. That's for 9 million people across 1/3 of all humanity, right? So this is what they've done, which is very little. It's nothing. Now, the problem is that there are many more. We have 24 registered vaccine manufacturers in India. Sputnik, the Russian vaccine, has licensed 6 of these companies to make vaccines for them together, right? There's no reason why AstraZeneca should have just licensed one Indian company. There's no reason why AstraZeneca should have concentrated its entire worldwide access. So the poor countries in the world constitute 50% of the world's population, right? And vaccines for all of them, according to the Western industry model, are being made by one company in one country. Now, that is a recipe for disaster, especially when that country is India and has the government that we have at the moment, which has seized those vaccines that don't belong to it as theirs and are using it for India because of a lack of planning. Now, the model should be to license these to as many companies in as many parts of the world as possible. Some of these countries have existing capacity. South Africa has extensive capacity. Brazil has long-standing capacity and is in fact making a version of the AstraZeneca vaccine there, among many other vaccines. Russia and China, as we've seen, have enormous capacity and resources. Argentina and Mexico are making other vaccines for themselves. There are vaccines in development, in deployment in Cuba, which has suffered now something like 70 years of economic sanctions very unfairly from the world, and is yet able to produce and create and deploy a vaccine for its own people, right? So there is enormous existing capacity, but with the opportunity to use already validated technology on a vaccine, right? There are also opportunities to let other actors, local philanthropic institutions, universities, and states. The states in poor countries are not always poor. They have money to invest. In some cases, the African Union has been buying vaccines from Russia because it simply cannot buy vaccines from the West. So part of the problem is not even affordability of vaccines, it's just simply getting any at all from anyone, because the Western vaccine manufacturers are just stocked out. So if there was technology that was available, these factories can be scaled very quickly. 1 year ago, mRNA, the technology that's used to make the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, didn't exist. It didn't exist in the West. Nobody had made an mRNA vaccine. The moment Pfizer and Moderna started those efforts with huge multi-billion-dollar grants and commitments from the US and the EU, they were very quickly able to scale existing pharmaceutical manufacturing units in Europe and in the United States to repurpose them within the space of 3 to 6 months, mind you, to make mRNA vaccines at a high quantity. There is no reason this cannot be done elsewhere in the world. It's entirely possible. When you make technology available, when you share and when you cooperate, you give other people incentives and opportunities to invest in that ecosystem to produce the life-saving pharmaceuticals and vaccines they need for their own health. They see the sense in it.
Thank you. I think those are some excellent points. Anne or Tammam, do you have anything to add?
I think I'm okay for now. Thank you.
Nice.
I guess just one thing that I would add there is I think that what Achal's describing does also help us to remember that we need to keep our eyes on the prize in the sense of We want dispersion, we want self-determination, we want the ability of many people to contribute to the innovation that is required in the face of crisis. And so sometimes I think that kind of the slogan or the, something else that kind of gets in the way of that. Like, so, with the mention of insulin, for example, I mean, the barrier to insulin is not patents. Right. So if we just imagine patents as all we need to do is stop patents, then we will have removed our eyes from that prize of, okay, we need diversification, we need self-determination, we need to bring all of the, the great innovations to bear, right? And so I think that there's, real importance in kind of avoiding a slip of hand that will often play into very problematic actors in global capital and Indian capital for that matter. I mean, so this thing of, India's the pharmacy of the developing world, fantastic. Well, they would love to be the pharmacy of the developed world too, because they've got deeper pockets. So, remembering that the companies it's not that they're evil, but companies are amoral, right? I mean, they follow profit, and I mean, that's what companies do, right? It's not a criticism of them to say that. It's just to know where you are at when you're engaging with companies, and making sure that you don't kind of forget and put some kind of salvation, an idea that there will be no need for critique once you have solved this one thing, or once you have gotten one company on board, that you always have to maintain that active engagement.
Yeah, so I suppose I'm taking from that the battle doesn't end.
Nope.
Thank you. So we have another question, which is a bit more specific to the UK. Do you think that the NHS protects against some of the systemic racism regarding access to medicines, or is that naive?
I think yes and no, right? So on the one hand, obviously you get just a really transformative difference when everyone can go to the doctor meaningfully. I mean, we know that there are still systematic exclusions, specifically around immigration status, for example, and some other things. But broadly, like it's a whole different ballgame in the UK than it is in the US. However, I think there's two things that we need to remember. So one of which is that the racism that pervades society is going to pervade healthcare as well, right? So, so the postal workers, right, who I talked about, and the one in the 911 call, this idea that, even when I remember in 2001, when I was a PhD student, listening to this 911 call and thinking, wow, he sounds like a paranoid Black guy, right? Like that's what he sounds like on the radio, when we know he's not paranoid, he knows exactly what's happening. And these ideas that, kind of who is believed to be telling the truth about their health, whose ill health is taken for granted, right? Like all of these things are, that are there in the world are also there in healthcare. And so that's one piece of it. And so I think that there's another layer too, which is that we have to remember, and Tammam mentioned a bit of this too, that access to healthcare is not the same thing as access to health, because not everything that we need in order to foster our health comes from biomedicine. And so things like housing conditions, things like a stressful urban environment, things like, all of these other elements that that get in the way of our ability to flourish as full humans, right? Or that foster the flourishing of some and deprive the flourishing of others, but all of these things still happen as well. And so, of course, that's really important in the Hurricane Katrina case, and understanding, when you're looking at devastation on that level, like medical care is going to be, relatively minor element of what's going on. And yet I still think that it's a vital site to engage. But, remembering that you can't just solve problems in health by providing health care. That justice itself is necessary for health.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just gonna start from the bottom because I've seen that there's a new message. So there's a question for Tammam, which is, you mentioned a couple of times the term hyper-capitalist. Would you say agree/disagree with that? Our activity in the realm of global health should be accompanied or complemented by class struggle?
This is a tough question. Again, 15 years ago, I would have, enthusiastically told you that, anything you do ever should be part of the global revolution. I hesitate now because of multiple things. First, grand narratives don't always apply and don't always matter to people who are sick today and need health care today. So having treated many patients in many different situations, you have to do whatever you can at every level. If you have a patient in front of you, you have to do everything you can so they get the best treatment that is possible under the circumstances. If you are in a position of a decision-making, you have to follow every way you can. Now, I've mentioned hypercapitalism because I don't believe that we can progress beyond a certain level of equity while still governed by a world that believes that profit trumps all motives. And that has been the case for a very long time, and many things have been tried and many victories have been won, and many of them have eroded afterwards because we go back to the supremacy of profit. Today, we are arguing with a waiver on the TRIPS agreement, which, to put it simply, is the agreement that governs intellectual property, so we can have transfer of technology and knowledge during the pandemic. And the same liberal democracies who are championing human rights and so on, so from the US to the UK, to Canada, to Norway, to Germany, to France, are against waiving the patents, even for a few months during the pandemic. Now, all that relates to capitalism. And I wouldn't say class struggle today with the same confidence I've done before, simply because we have sat in the past 2 decades and seen the failure after failure of the Western left to live up to a global equity narrative. They still read themselves in terms that are 100 years old. They're still talk about wage labor as opposed in Western industrial settings, as opposed to the global image we have now. They still talk about borderless world without concern about how you help people under the current borders. So all that is to suggest that I have a different framework that I find very useful. An Indian philosopher by the name of Gayatri Spivak has written about subalterns. And her famous 1984, I think, article is Can the Subalterns Speak? And she borrows the term, and the whole subalternity studies borrows the term from Gramsci, who's an Italian communist thinker of the 1930s. And the difference here is that they are not talking about workers versus capitalists while ignoring gender issues, while ignoring race issues. What they are talking is about the excluded in society. And if you look at global health, I do not find it difficult to imagine describing a global health subalternity whereby the Black communities in the US share plenty with people in countries that, like Guyana, for example, that you've talked about, Achal, in the exclusion, the minorification, the negligence of people's interest, the denial of their lack of access, and so on, while saying the market will solve everything. So I think looking at it whereby we understand capitalism as a big part of the problem is important, while not falling in the traps of exclusionary rhetoric in itself that comes with the traditional Marxist discourse, at least.
Thank you. Do the other speakers have anything to add? No, that's fine. I am mindful of time, so we'll have a couple of last 2 questions. I'm just looking at Rebecca. Okay, so there's one that says, wouldn't just moving the pharmaceutical hubs outside the West create a bigger problem in terms of multinational companies' globalization, considering that established pharmaceuticals will be less likely to let go of market shares and will still have power over non-Western hubs? Considering that scenario, how do you envisage moving pharmaceutical hubs outside the West?
I could take a
Yeah,
stab at it.
absolutely.
Yeah. Look, I think that when I talked about one specific aspect as an alternative means of access to vaccines and other pharmaceuticals, as dispersing the base of pharmaceutical innovation. I think that there are several things that have to be done with the corporations that produce the pharmaceuticals and vaccines we need to live. We have to look at ways to have more cooperation from Western manufacturers. We need to have more manufacturers just generally, geographically. But I do want to question the idea that we're all trapped inside this idea that it's only corporations who can produce these pharmaceutical vaccines we need to live, right? And especially a handful of very big ones. This has not always been the case. And in fact, this is not always the case even today. And my favorite example of a utopian idea, which had I been in a position to propose that to a group of pharmaceutical manufacturers or at a WHO meeting, for instance, would have been laughed out of the room, is the way that the flu vaccine we all take is produced. I've done some work on this with a couple of other economists who've been interested in this model, but since 1974, so for about now 40 years, right, 45 years, we've had a system of production that's entirely cooperative. There are 140 laboratories across 110 countries which cooperate every year to share intelligence on flu strains in their countries. This is an exercise that costs tens of millions of dollars, nearly $100 million. It's coordinated out of the WHO in a unit called the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response System, GISRS. What they do then is accumulate all that collective intelligence and monitoring from around the world. It's an intergovernmental cooperative effort. And what they do then is to produce a formula for a flu vaccine in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere and release that into the open. There's no intellectual property. There are no monopolies associated with it. What it means is that several small pharmaceutical manufacturers can produce that vaccine. What that means in turn is that the flu vaccine that we all take, by the way, to survive the flu season in the billions and have taken for 45 years is a cooperatively, jointly produced effort, which it is shocking to me, isn't held up as a model for more types of diseases and problems as a solution that creates equity, that does involve markets, but doesn't create oligopolistic or monopolistic markets for these life-saving products, right? Which gives every participating country, small or big or poor or rich, a degree of agency in controlling its own flu system by monitoring itself and reporting the flu strains that are there. It is a beautiful example of cooperation, and it's not clear why more things can't be done this way. Many economists have proposed changes to the pharmaceutical delivery system, and especially the monopolistic tendencies of the market-driven system that we have. And there are several alternatives. So the solutions about geographical diversity, I think, fit into a larger dialogue that we must have whenever it's time to, because it never seems to be the time to, about the organization of the pharmaceutical industry business model itself, right? Whether we should follow the same model that we have for producing luxury bags by designers, and whether we should apply any kind of difference between that model and the model for pharmaceuticals, which are slightly more necessary for us to live.
Thank you. And Mom?
And do you want to go? Or?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So this is a very good example, Achal. Thank you about the flu vaccine. I would like to mention another one, which is the Dndi, or Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. And this is one that has gone for nearly 20 years now, if I'm not wrong. And it's an non-governmental organization that works on research and development for medicines for neglected diseases. Much less, so the goal is to produce medicines that are available for neglected diseases, not only because they are patented, but also because no one does research and development on them. And they've produced a medicine for recently for sleeping sickness, which moves us from injectable, very difficult treatment to oral. And I've worked on programs dealing with sleeping sickness. There are only few pockets, and they are very hard to reach, very hard to diagnose. This is a massive jump towards possible elimination. So there are models, but there are also ones that have been intentionally suppressed. And this is interesting because it was mentioned, I'm not sure, I think Achal mentioned it, that much of what we have patented today is paid for already by the taxpayers. You pay twice for the same medicines. And that's not accidental, that's intentional. It was legislated, I think in 1982 in the US, that the National Institutes for Health can give patents to pharmaceutical companies without asking for any royalties or putting any conditions on the resulting drugs. So many of the pharmaceutical companies that talk endlessly about the innovation and about needing all those patents for innovation get a lot of the compounds from publicly funded initiatives or by absorbing small companies. And the model now is you create, if you're a professor in a university and have the potential of developing, instead of developing it in your university, you leave, you go create a micro company, develop the compound, and then get bought by a major company. So the model has been skewed into using as much taxpayer money as possible to develop the compounds, and then the company only does the trials. And the trials not necessarily very ethically, because as you may have heard the early days of the vaccine, the two French scientists advocating for the testing of the vaccine compounds in Africa and trials in Africa, and what is I wouldn't rant about it, but there's an article wrote by Professor Dr. Fofana. I'll find it and attach it, where it talks about that specific incident and how does it relate to racism and decolonizing global health. So people who get trialed, taxpayers don't get paid back. There are no conditions on access. People who get into the trials don't get compensated or given the drugs later. All of it is an exploitative system that is meant to extract as much public funding as possible without paying back. And Achal talked about CEPI and Gavi, and now they are being funded. They are funding companies without asking them for conditions on. So BioNTech and Pfizer got what, in the vicinity of $2 billion of funding, right? And there's no condition on that for them to make anything available publicly. AstraZeneca only does it because they were forced to, because Oxford promised Oxford promised to not license it to a private company, but then they did. And they sublicensed it to the Serum Institute. And the Serum Institute, we have plenty of insights on how the Serum Institute is acting exactly as you said, Achal. They are selling it to African countries for more than AstraZeneca is selling it to European countries, because that's an extension of the monopoly. So yes, some solutions are needed, but it boggles the mind that taxpayers go on paying for drugs twice in places, especially like the US, where 30, 40 million people without Obamacare wouldn't get even basic coverage, and they pay for it, and no one gets bothered. And the legislators, I think Glazer, who legislated that one in '82, is still in Congress. He's senile now, but at least recently he was still in Congress. He's been elected for 40 years while having intentionally deprived people from access to their own tax money. So it's astonishing how we keep seeing the thing happening over and over and over again. And sorry, go ahead. I should be stopped from ranting sometimes.
Oh, no, I agree with you. But I just think, while we have all these young folks here, I also just want to highlight, I agree that we've seen the same thing happening for a long time, but it does feel like a moment where change is possible. And we have had moments, so for me, in my 40s, right, I have seen moments happen where there have been moments of possibility. And it kind of is amazing to me that this does feel like potentially a moment for that, where it's been just kind of taken for granted that the only way that people will innovate is if they can make $1 gazillion, which we know is not true, right? We're all doing curiosity-driven science in one way or another, and it's not because we want to make $1 gazillion, right? And even drug discovery scientists, who I actually know, right? I have worked closely with some of whom are the $1 gazillion motivated, but some of whom aren't, right? They want to solve problems. People like solving problems. That's a deeply human kind of enterprise, and I don't mean that to the exclusion of animals, but to the inclusion of the better part of our nature, right? And so I think that, there's even, Biden the other day talking about demands that medical research that's funded by the US government be published and openly accessible, right? Like even those things are, it feels like it's a moment in which people are saying, you know what, maybe we need to reorient our financial investments to be where our ethical investments are. And so I don't know, I'm optimistic. And I think if y'all keep pushing, it has some hope.
There's always hope. But
Can I just say one thing?
Oh, sorry.
No. Sorry. I just wanted to say that the act that you're referencing is the Bidol Act. And the curious thing about the Bidol Act and its subsequent UK avatar about 8 years later in 1988, which Margaret Thatcher put in just before she left, the Bidol Act, of course, was Birch Evans Bai and Bob Dole, who then became a Viagra spokesperson. I just want to say, I mean, so it literally was on the payroll of Pfizer after introducing the Bidol Act and, enabling the most whole-scale theft of US taxpayer money in the history of the United States, then began to work for Pfizer, but not just for Pfizer, for Viagra. Anyway, I just thought it was a funny.
I just want to say something to not appear like a cynic, because, if you were a cynic, you wouldn't even talk about it anymore. But I think part of the discontent is at how long it took me to realize all this, how much of my career I've spent as a company man, as swallowing all the rhetoric that is being thrown at us. And what I see now is an opportunity where students, as Achal mentioned, you're much more conscientious now than I was or we were when we were your age. And this is a moment. This is absolutely a moment. What I fear is being absorbed into, you want change, you need to sit on the table and be polite and nice and do it through the system. Look at all the changes we're making. And some of that needs to be happened. But I'll end my intervention with quoting two women of color, one now and one 45 years ago. The one now is Leota Hirsch from London School, who talks about decoloniality and who talks about how can we, is it possible to actually decolonize global health institutions? And I've just put the article. And the other one is Audre Lorde, who has talked about exclusion and inclusion in I think in 85, this one, in 81 actually. And it's about the uses of anger. And this is fascinating because we are expected to sit and be polite and smile and write, stuff that won't be published or read, and speak in only recognizable journals where we do not have proper access. And sometimes we need to do that and more. And the and more has been excised of our public life, and it might need to be back for this moment to actually bear fruit. And a couple of days ago, I was talking to a Swiss scientist about decolonization, and she was, saying, yes, all legal means. And I said, who said legal? And legal is not just. And if we stuck to all legal means, we wouldn't have changed anything, because Bidol is legal, is a law, but protesting is not. And illegal doesn't mean violent, to be clear, but the Extinction Rebellion are doing illegal stuff and getting themselves arrested intentionally. And they got heard more than many others. And they protected each other and they acted in solidarity. And their book called This Is Not a Drill is fascinating because it talks about everything from the grand picture to the view of someone who's cooking for the protesters. And it's interesting because there is a space for action that goes beyond what we are offered, obviously. And I think if this is a moment, then this is a moment to explore beyond that.
I just want to jump in there and say that we are past time, but this has been an incredible discussion. And I think that was a very appropriate note to end on, Tammam. Thank you, because, change, we can only change better, hopefully, from here. And it's amazing to have had inspiring people like yourselves here today. So thank you so much. I think I'm going to hand over to Aisha and Rebecca now, who will lead us onward into the day. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Wow, thank Thank you so much to all our speakers and to all our participants for asking so many interesting questions. I think there's been such an amazing and fascinating discussion happening here today, and I can't thank you enough for bringing up all these points and helping us all reflect on these important issues. I think Anne's point on remembering our goal is not just removing patents, but aiming for diversification and self-determination is something that will really stick with me and something we'll be thinking about at UAEM and SFGH, I'm sure, for a long time. On that note, if you enjoyed the discussion today and you'd like to get more involved, there's lots of opportunities, so please do check out the SFGH and UAEM social media pages, both on a national level and a local level. There's so many ways you can be involved in taking part in all these important discussions and shaping global health as we move forward. I know we've had a lot of resources put in the chat. Don't worry if you weren't able to look at them all now. They will be available on the Padlet, and there will also be any questions that weren't answered, which will be followed up on hopefully by our amazing speakers. So thanks again to everyone, and thanks also to Maria for chairing this discussion. I think as we are now meant to be on coffee break and we've overrun, we'll probably delay the next set of workshops until 11:10 to allow for everyone to have a quick break. So we'll be seeing you at 11:10 for workshops, either for transparency in clinical trials with Dr. Till Brutner and Soraya Kistra, or research and development the right way with UAEM and Sabrina Vilma. So I'll put the links in the chat in a second, so you can all go to the workshop you are most interested in. And I think there's also voting for national committee members and representatives, which will be happening on a parallel Zoom call. I think you all already have the links for that, so that should be fine. All right, I'll put the links in the chat if you've missed them before, and we look forward to seeing you soon in our workshops. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us for our third plenary today.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Stars.